Today I want to ask you a question. How can difficult circumstances in our life work out for greater good in the progress of the gospel? And we're starting Philippians today, just an incredible chapter that we're looking at in chapter 1 today, an incredible just book of the Bible. And, you know, we see Paul, and he gives us a picture of how we can find joy in the midst of life. You know, I asked my little boy a season back, just a lot of crazy things were going on, and definitely true of that now with all the things that are happening around us. But there were some just crazy moments just in family and extended family. And I was talking to him, and I said, buddy, I said, how are you doing? I said, what do you make of all this? And he looked at me and he went, life. And I thought about that, and it's so true, because the reality is that all of us face difficult circumstances, that all of us face hard times. And some of those moments can be very difficult to progress, to process. And Paul said in verse 12 of Philippians chapter 1, he said, now I want you to know, brethren, that my circumstances have turned out for greater progress of the gospel. And I think about the things that we navigate, the difficult circumstances that we walk through. Truth is, every person, no matter what you may hear on TV talking about, there's a gospel out there, this health and wealth, that says, hey, there's nothing you're ever going to face that's difficult. Jesus said, in this world, you will have trouble. We're going to face difficult times. Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, he said that God causes the sun to rise on the evil and the good, that he sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. We're going to see good things, and we experience good things, but we also, believer or unbeliever, we experience difficulties in the midst of life as we walk in the brokenness. But the difference in how we as followers of Jesus Christ respond to difficult circumstances makes all the difference. Because the truth is, none of us can control the trials that we face. None of us can control the difficulties that we walk through. There are certain things that we can do, and obviously those can allow different circumstances to impact our life. But there's some things that are out of our control. But what we can control is our response and our perspective. And the perspective that Paul had, he said, all the trials that I face, he said, I see those as opportunities for the gospel to progress, and it changes everything. Look at verse 13. The gospel progresses in our lives when other people hear of our faith. He said, so that my imprisonment in the cause of Christ has become well known throughout the whole Praetorian Guard and to everyone else. And Paul's imprisonment in the cause of Christ is known by those guarding him and everyone else. They're talking, right? They're navigating this. Remember in the book of Acts when you know about Paul and Silas, and they were praying and singing hymns of praise to God, and the prisoners, Scripture says, were listening to them. The jailer was impacted in an incredible way, and Paul says here, listen, I'm rejoicing not because of my circumstances, but I'm rejoicing because I know God is sovereign in the midst of the circumstances. I love this thought. A.W. Tozer said, what comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us. And the problem for joyless Christians and people that are believers, but, you know, feel like there's you can kind of just feel overwhelmed, and we all can feel that for a moment. Right, but we can focus on our circumstances instead of the God that's over our circumstances. And our flesh is what we walk in when we are discouraged and weary and just worn out in the midst of those things. But as we walk in the Spirit and we remember who God is and that He's sovereign over the circumstances, even then in the difficult circumstances, we can find joy. See, verse 14, he says, there's other believers that are impacted by this, and they're encouraged to share. So he says, other people know about it. And then he says, and most of the brethren, trusting in the Lord because of my imprisonment, have far more courage to speak the gospel without fear. Can I give you just a little short statement that is so true? Courage is contagious. Paul says, we can't help but speak those things that we've seen and heard. We're going to share the good news of the gospel. I'm going to find joy even in the midst of my imprisonment. And the life that Paul is living in those circumstances causes other people to be courageous. So courage is contagious, but discouragement also is. It doesn't take long for that to spread either. Verse 15, he said, some, to be sure, are preaching Christ from envy and strife, and some from goodwill. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I am appointed for the defense the gospel. The former proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition rather than from pure motives, thinking to cause me distress in my imprisonment. But regardless of the motives, those that are preaching Christ, God is glorified. Man, it's just an incredible picture of how when we are willing to glorify God in the midst of difficult times, in the midst of suffering, in the midst of hard things, that the gospel progresses in incredible ways. And so in the midst of, as my little boy says, life, we're going to face difficult things. But if we'll keep our eyes fixed on Him, if we'll remember in the midst of those moments to lift up our eyes, right? Psalm 121, those Jewish pilgrims, as they were on their way to the feast days, they would get weary, and Scripture said that, it says, I will lift mine eyes unto the hills, for whence cometh my help. My help comes from the Lord. And then it goes on and says He never sleeps or slumbers, never gets distracted or discouraged. We just know that our God is able to do abundantly above what we can ask or think. We know that He is sovereign in the midst of those things. So in the midst of our trials, in the midst of the difficulty, our response in those situations, joyfully just seeking that the gospel would go forth, changes everything. C.S. Lewis said that God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks to us in our conscience, but shouts in our pains. It is His megaphone to rouse a deaf world. Man, I pray God will use all of our circumstances, all the situation that we're in right now, for greater gospel progress because of the joy that the world might see in us. God bless.